Hey, what's up? So today we're going to make a utility route handler, which will allow you to get type hints on the different routes that are available. And I'll also give you information on what kind of information you need to pass in order to make the route work. So for instance, here we have a route login, and it tells us we need a username and password attached to an object, which will probably be like what we're inserting into the body or something like that. If we were to do something like log out, it wants nothing, and it's going to give us no type hints because we don't want anything. And if we were to include something like username, it's going to give us an error. Now, if you've ever worked with TypeScript, I'm sure you've done like stuff like strings or things that will help you type a very simple function. But if you've never worked with something like this, it can be a little complicated, and there's a lot of reasons why you would want a utility function that works like this. For instance, if you were to change something on the back end and they have like a shared type library, it would trigger changes on the front end, which would do stuff like fail your CI/CD pipeline, telling you that you've messed something up on the front end. Alternatively, if you were to use something wrong, you can save yourself a lot of headaches by just not needing to look things up. You have it right where you need it all the time. So I'd consider something like this pretty non-negotiable in a code base. It's pretty easy to set up, so let's go do that. So the things we're going to need to implement this are type, key of, generics. We're going to figure out how to access members of a type, whether it's an array or an object. And then we're just going to figure out one non-intuitive thing in order to make sure that we can allow the passing of nothing in an object as opposed to the passing of anything. You'll see what I mean when we get there. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we are on the same page about types. So let's create a type. We're going to make an object, and then we're going to pass in 3 different keys, A, B, and C. These are all strings. So this is different than like a blank object. This is an object with fixed keys, which is what our route inputs and route outputs are going to be. Next, we will create the keys of our object. So this is pretty intuitive as long as you know it exists. It's just key of an object. And if you hover over this, it's going to tell you it's key of an object, and that's not helpful. So this is a trick you can use in TypeScript to kind of extrapolate out the type. So in this case, we can see that the keys of the object are A, B, and C. They're string literals. So you can see these correspond with these. And just for completion's sake, let's just do that with an actual value instead of a type. So here we have an object. It's a object, and it has 3 keys, A, B, and C, which are not strings, but whatever. And we can extrapolate out the keys by doing key of type of obj. So the difference here, of course, is that this is a type and this is a value. So we need to derive the type of the value, which we use with type of, and then the variable. And then we can get the key of it as we normally do. So let's actually implement this. So we begin with a type. It's going to be called route inputs. It's going to, let's go get the keys from it. So it'll be key of route inputs. Right now there are none. So let's create our keys. One is called /login. These will represent routes on an API. And we're going to assume that the person calling it is going to pass in an object that has the minimum information required to use the route correctly. So in this case, we have a username string, password string, and then here's a trick one. So for our logout route, we want nothing to be passed in. And if you just did an empty object, what that actually means is any kind of object. So that's not what we're looking for. What we want here is a record, which again is a different way of representing an object. And then for our first thing here, we're going to provide a string. So this is a object keyed by strings as opposed to an object keyed by numbers or something like that. Then we're going to do comma, never. So this is the value. So it's a object keyed by strings, and then the value is never, which means it can never happen. So this is how you create an object with nothing on it. Next, we'll provide the profile. It's an object, and then we have username, string, and then nothing else. So let's take a look here. We'll do route keys and empty object, and we can see that we have a union of string literals that correspond with the keys here. So we can use these in our function to give us type hints, or value hints. So let's create our first attempt of this. So let's create a function called intellisense, and then we are going to provide one parameter here, which is route, and we're going to say it's a string. So this will give you type safety. This is technically correct TypeScript. It's not very useful because when you go to pass in something and press Control-Shift-Space for hints, and it's going to give you nothing because any string is good. But we know that when we're working on an API, most strings are bad, in fact. So we need to somehow limit this down, and we can do that by creating the function again. We're going to create a route, and then this is going to be route keys. It's going to be any of the 3 keys defined up here, and again, it's going to be this, this, or this. So now when we go to type, it gives us hints on the 3 possible things it could be. And if you don't know how to use this right, you can press Control-Shift-Space and it will, or Control-Space. Control-Shift-Space will bring up the function definition. Control-Space will bring up hints for the values. Now, this is partially done, but it doesn't give us any information on like what kind of object we should be putting in when we're calling our routes. So that'll be the next thing we work on. So you can access the value of something by doing route inputs, and then we are going to do square brace notation to access a member on it. And you can see that it gives us the 3 keys it could be. Let's say we do login, and these are the inputs we expect here. So this is the value at this key. And you can see that we have type hints here. However, this is not going to be good enough for a function because we can manually type /login here, but that's not how we're going to be calling the function. We need a way to not be hard coding 5 different functions for 5 different endpoints or something like that. So let's take a look at what kind of options we have available. So let's go over this real quick. So we have an array type here. This is a type which represents a number. We have these square braces, and now it's a type that represents an array. So it's an array of numbers. Here, we want to access the value of a member of R. Again, well, that's going to be a number. So we do R, and then we do square braces, and this time we're going to put something in the square braces. So this is saying some number on R, and that's going to give us back a number. So for instance, it would give us back this, or this, or this, assuming it was an object, which is not. So let's go over how to do objects. We have a object. It's got three keys, which are different to represent how these are different. So it's got a number, a string, and a number. Now, you might try and create the type like this, where it's obj. Okay, so you might want to put string here, like we put number here, but the difference is that arrays can have any kind of number inside the index, and this is not a generic object, right? This is an object with fixed keys A, B, and C. So the way we need to do it, in the same way that we provided the literal key when we were creating that type before, we need to create something that can stand for all 3 of those literal keys. So in this case, we can just do key of obj. So this is some key that's A, B, or C that is on obj, and it's going to give us a union of the types of things that could be returned. So in this case, it could be a number or a string or a number. So that's why we're getting this union here. So let's apply this to a function, and we're going to almost get the answer. So that's what I was talking about before. You can't use string because our route inputs only accept 3 things, not just any string. So the way we do it here, of course, is going to be key of route inputs on our route inputs. And that's going to give us our 3 items that it could be. Now let's create our function. So here's the function body. We're going to have route be our first parameter. It's going to be of route keys. Then we're going to have data, and it's going to be a route value, which represents some member on route inputs. Now, when we go to run this, we're not going to be happy with how it turns out because this is going to give us IntelliSense, just like it did before. But it is not going to give us the correct inputs to pass in. So for instance, we said that for profile, we just wanted a username, but it's giving us username and password. And this is even more obvious if we were to do logout, and it's giving us both things here when it should be giving us none of them. So the reason is because route values is just the union of all these things. So when we go here to type in the options that we need to pass into this function, it's going to give us just like the widest net it can. And that's because we have no way of like narrowing down what route we're on so that we can access the correct value for the key. Right now, like we can obviously see that these two are related, but TypeScript has no way of knowing there's a relationship between what's passed in here and what it should be giving you hints on here. So we'll cover how to do that using generics. So here's how you create a function. So you have const function name, and then you do the parameters required and the function body. So when we need a generic, it has a different syntax that looks pretty weird. So it's going to be your function name, and then we're gonna do our parameters in the function body, and then we need to do this less than or equal sign, and we're gonna put the information about our generic over here. So in this case, generic is the name. It's like a type variable, I guess, that represents like a relationship between something you pass in when you're calling the function and other types. So in this case, we're going to do generic extends some type. When we actually call this, it's going to be route inputs. And you can call this whatever you want. So in this case, we'll do arg1, and then we're going to say the type is G. So whatever we pass in here is related to some type in some way when we're calling it. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So we have our route IntelliSense function. Here's the function body. We're going to create our generic. So less than, greater than. We call it T. A lot of people just call it like T or R or like G or something like that. And it's going to extend route keys. So again, that's going to be /login/logout/profile. And then route is going to be some member T of route keys. So again, it's just, instead of saying like any route key, it's like one specific route key. And we only know what T is when we go to call this. So let's create our data, and then we're going to do route inputs, and we're going to access a member of that using the square braces. And the member we're going to access is T. So when we do /login is going to be T. And then we're going to do route inputs, and we're going to access a member T, which is /login. So this will take in the proper options that we need. So const x equals route IntelliSense. Let's pass in /login, and you can see that's going to give me data with a username string, password string. If I were to do /profile, you can see we have username and no password. And if we were to do /logout, you can see that we want just an empty object. So this is working how we intended, and now we just need to figure out how to return the correct route output type. So for our final step, we need to begin by setting up the route outputs. So here's our type route outputs, and we're going to make keys that match route inputs. So here we have a /login. We'll return something like success true, and then an optional error. I guess this should be a Boolean, but whatever. We'll have logout, which has success. That should also be a Boolean. And then we have profile, which has different kinds of things. So let's say like a username, a bio, and then like links to social media or something, I don't know. So that's how we're going to do that. And now we just need to go down to our implementation. So here we're assuming we have a response of type any, and then I just have a string in here. So the reason why this is okay is because when you are using fetch and then you do result.json and you run that, it's going to be of type any. And then if you're using like stricter typesetting rules, it might be set as unknown. in which case you need to use like a type guard or something. But usually, by default, it's going to be any. So that's what I'm going with here. I'll fix that in a sec. So we need to create our route function, and we need to do our less than greater than for the generic. We're going to do t extends route keys. Then we'll have our route. It's going to be of type t, which is some member of route keys. Then we're going to have data. It's going to be route inputs and some member of it corresponding to whatever t is. And then we have to do the the return type. You do colon and then whatever the type is. So in this case, it's going to be route outputs, and then some member of it that corresponds with t. And here we're just returning API call response as if we were returning, the fetch.json. So this is going to be any, but since any has type checking skipped, this is going to be the exact output that we need. And you got to go validate that on your front end, just like you normally would. So to show how this works, let's do profile. It's asking for just one thing, which is username. And you can see here that the type returned corresponds with the route outputs for profile. And if we did log out, it has an error here because we're providing information that shouldn't be there. And then if you go to X, you can see that we have an output of the type that corresponds with logout. So this is pretty much working. We just need one more thing for async await to make it a little more realistic for an API call. So just like we talked about before, we have the same exact function here. In order to make this actually asynchronous, we need to match the types. So I'm going to start by making this function async, and then we're going to make this function async, and we're getting an error here because it's telling us we're returning a promise, but the type here does not say promise. So let's fix that. We do promise, and promise takes in a generic, so you do the less than greater than, and then you put in the type that the promise is returning. So this is a promise of this shape. Now let's call it. I'm going to do login and provide the things here. And then you can see when we hover over X that this is a promise. So we need to unwrap it using await. And now we have the shape we're expecting. So that is a more realistic version because obviously all fetch requests are going to be asynchronous. So just to recap, we created our type route inputs. It is an object. It has 3 keys on it. And then these correspond with the minimum information required to get the function or the route functioning properly. And you're going to need to pass these into the body or like however you need them in your call. And then route keys here is created using key of route inputs. So it's going to match these keys into a string literal union. And then our type route outputs is going to be keys that match the keys here. And we're going to return the shape of the expected response from the API. After that, we are creating our function. We need to create a generic that extends route keys. So it's t is some member of route keys. Our route is going to be t. Our inputs are going to be some member of route inputs corresponding with t. The output is going to be a promise with a type of route outputs corresponding with t. And then we just return that, and you can see we have whatever shape we're expecting. So that's how you do that. I use this in all my projects for the last couple of years. It's not very hard to set up, and it gets extremely useful whenever you're refactoring code or whenever your API starts getting bigger, like 15, 20 requests. It becomes like way too annoying to have to look it up every time you're using a route and like hunt down all the places that are using a route every time you make a change. Hope that was helpful. Catch you.